Welcome to the You Need a Training podcast, hosted by Heart & Solutions, a strength-based counseling agency. We know that the life of a mental health professional can be busy, and finding time to complete those continuing education credit hours can be a challenge. With that in mind, this show is focused on helping mental health providers easily access continuing education credits on a variety of topics. The best part? These trainings, many of which will provide at least one credit hour, can be completed anywhere you listen to your podcasts. Traveling to and from work? Great. Taking a walk? Excellent. Enjoying a quiet moment on the couch? Perfect. No matter where you are, get ready for engaging, thought-provoking conversations that double as CE hours because we all know you need a training.
Hello. Welcome to episode 2 of our You Need a Training podcast. For those that are just getting to know us, I am Dr. Colleen Grote, the Vice President of Therapy at Heart & Solutions. I have a PhD in counselor education and supervision. I am a licensed mental health counselor in the state of Iowa and a registered play therapist supervisor. I'm also joined today by the owner and president of Heart & Solutions, Dr. Julie Johnson.
Hello. Glad to be here.
For those of you who listen to our other podcast, You Need a Counselor, you may be very familiar with Julie. For those of you that haven't listened to You Need a Counselor yet, you should. So be sure to check that out. But Julie, welcome to the training side of things today. I am really excited to have you here, and I'm really excited to be starting to grow this training platform. Today's an especially exciting day because we have an incredible guest with us from outside of the Heart & Solutions family, and I will let Julie introduce our guest today.
All right. Our guest today joins us from the Quad Cities. We've got Bre Hirst here with us today. Now, Bre is a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Illinois, and she's also a licensed independent social worker in the state of Iowa. When you are in the Quad Cities, you've got to be dual licensed at some point. She has been providing mental health support for over 5 years there. She teaches social work-oriented classes at Black Hawk College and also at St. Ambrose University. She has started a private practice called Wholehearted Connections and currently provides services as an associate of Blue Tree Counseling and Consultation. So we are excited to have you here, Bre, to explain to us and help us learn about how to understand mental health and human behavior through a polyvagal lens and a language-oriented lens. Very, very excited to have you here, Bre. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to share kind of my both practice style and community education style. From my perspective, they both kind of go hand in hand when I kind of organize the information. And that's also what has helped it seem easier for me to kind of help clients better understand it and help other people in a more macro level understand it too.
Absolutely. You sound like a lifelong learner who loves to learn because you love to share that knowledge with other people. And what a great way to do that by sharing what you've learned out of your own curiosity and desire to understand and really, really spread that out to others. So we're so grateful that you're here and excited to learn from you. So this is a 2-part conversation today. So part 1 is today, and then we will have you back for part 2, just because there's so much information that you're going to be sharing with us. So we'd love to go ahead and let's get started with part 1.
Absolutely. So the reason why kind of my brain has organized it into 2 parts is because for me, what I've learned through the neurobiology and polyvagal lens is that we have kind of our body regulation, our nervous system, brain things going on. And then we have the emotional processing going on the other hand. And that's where that language oriented lens, and that's the part 2 of it. So that's why that's kind of later. So we'll swing back to those specifics during part 2. So for part 1, we have multiple things we're going to cover. So generally what we're going to walk through today is kind of our internal and external systems, what's going on in them and between them. Through that, we're going to learn kind of the sensory systems, how each of those are contributing to how systems are interacting and how we use those then to help with the regulation piece that we hear a lot of right now, that co-regulation and regulation wording. And then today we're going to end with that idea of mindfulness, another kind of hot word that we hear all the time, and kind of breaking that down to understanding it more what it is and helping clients more simply understand what it is too. So internal and external systems, and stop me wherever and whenever you have questions, because I can just like talk and talk and talk. That's what I usually tell my students as well. So a lot of the work that I'm pulling from is going to be from books like The Body Keep the Score by Vessel Vanderkolk, by let me get to my references page here so I don't mess anyone up, by Dr. Brene Brown, by Deb Dana, who has taken the polyvagal theory, which was developed by Steve Porges. She's a licensed clinical social worker, and she's kind of taken that research study and translated it into language that us clinical kind of professionals can better understand if we don't or aren't as in tune with that research oriented language. And then Robin Gobble, she is actually who I first took a training from in the like right after grad school, and that is what introduced me to the neurobiology. So what I've learned through her, through the Body Keeps the Score, through the work by like Dr. Bruce Perry, all of those kind of influential people, is that our neurobiology is like really what's in the driver's seat. And we kind of have our brain, which has a few different parts, and then we have our nervous system that has a few different parts. And so this is how I, would walk through it with clients. And so first I start with the brain, and usually start very general, whether it's a kid or an adult, because even if it's an adult, they likely have kids or are around kids, depending on what they do. And for some adults, even for myself at times, when things are frustrating or, really chaotic, it's easier to have simple language for our brains to better understand. So first I start by separating it into like the upstairs, downstairs brain, because then it's really simple for your kids and adults. They even can do like the hand brain, like Dr. Dan Siegel, and we go through and we walk through what our upstairs brain is responsible for and what our downstairs brain is responsible for. Then we talk about neuroception, and that's where the brain is scanning for danger. Research has shown it's scanning for danger 4 times every second. So it is scanning all of the time. And so then I break down with clients and do interventions like, what types of things would your specific brain scan for danger? Because I think what I hear from clients is that's what we get away from, is we like to tell people what is scary or dangerous, but really that's unique to each of us. And so that's another thing I've really had to put into practice, and rather than teach what's scary, ask them what's scary. And so then you get things like relationships with friends, asking someone out, taking a big test, right? And all of those kind of things start to come up, rather than just, don't touch a hot stove, or, look both ways across the street. While those are absolutely still the same thing, we often hear less of the other side. And so it's bringing those into the conversation. Then it's breaking it down even further, because when it senses for danger, our responses can be really different. We hear of the fight, flight, and kind of shutdown responses. And that's where that polyvagal theory comes in. And so again, first, it's kind of that attunement to that internal system of each client. What does fight, flight, shutdown look for you, right? It looks different for me than it does my husband, than it does my 8-month-old, than it does, my mom, right? And so it's bringing those examples in and talking about how each of those, while all contributing, are, they're all operating for the same reason and doing that to keep us safe. Does that still make sense and still with me? Excellent. So then we walk into our nervous system, and that's where that polyvagal theory and that lens comes in. And so what I teach is that, and like what the Deb Dana work teaches, is that you kind of have your connected energy. I like to use the word energy. I think that, sits well with most people. And if not, we use whatever word does, right? That's that client-centered approach. So I usually offer up energy. So we have our connected energy. That's like how we are right now. Then we have our mobilized energy. That's that fight flight energy. And then we have, and like for polyvagal, those words are ventral for the connected energy. For the fight, flight, mobilized energy, that's going to be the sympathetic. And then for the shutdown, that's the dorsal nervous system kind of coming into play. And why I like Deb Dana is because she's probably also a visual learner. And I know that people won't be able to see this that you guys are seeing, but she created this whole flip chart thing that actually walks through and teaches clients, and then also just has it ready for us clinicians on where the dorsal nervous system response came from and how long that has existed, for evolution, how long then the fight flight, and how each of these serve a purpose to us as humans. And now we've reached the connected, the ventral. And that's where, even when I think of like my classes with social work students versus like my 6-year-old clients, we talk about how survival of the fittest is really those of us who are able to collaborate and work together to kind of be inclusive, right? Versus that idea of like the strongest physical is the fittest. Well, when we reframe that a little bit and look at how we are going to survive as that external bigger system, not just the internal system, that's where we start to see those systems interacting then, right? And so that's then still where that social work perspective of that systematic thinking, I think that's how my brain has really like connected this type of framing to both our internal neurobiology and our external kind of societal systems, right? I would say if we, we're objectively looking at our society from outward in, we're probably in a pretty mobilized state right now, right? We can see it, we can feel it. And then when we think of times like the Great Depression, that's likely when we felt more in that shutdown, that dorsal state. And so then it's bringing in those ideas to also help clients acknowledge and recognize that, yes, we have some neurobiology things that we can influence, and we have to take into account how our external systems are also kind of impacting that then, and taking ownership over what we can. And then that's where that piece comes of letting go of what we don't need to own then, right? When we learn like these are the things that are contributing. No, you don't always have to be 15 minutes early if that's just so stressful and it's bringing you to a brink, right? Like let yourself have some grace around it. And even just giving people that language of having permission sometimes is, the only thing they need. And then they start to feel better. Like, oh, wait, I guess I can just, give myself the allowance to do that. So that's kind of where it starts, is helping clients first understand that internal, external systems kind of working together, how they're not working together, maybe kind of resyncing that into balance.
It's such great information, Bre. And I know you mentioned a lot of times that you give the word energy. I'm curious if there's some other words that clients have connected to, or what some alternatives for that explanation and that term energy may be that you've found.
Sure. Yeah. So some of them choose just to straight do like connected, mobilized, or shut down, because that's the easiest to do. In Robin's work, she talks about the brain in different forms of animals. And so that's even, again, where you give clients the leeway of, like, what would you say your connected is? Is that you playing, or is that you reading a book, right? Then draw a book if that's what that thinks you of. For me, my mobilized energy, I visualize myself pacing around my house trying to like do all the things, right? So it's energy, it's specific tasks that it will be. It can be the animals like turtle for shutdown, maybe a cat for mobilized, and a playful dog for connected. That's what one of the things shows in the polyvagal kind of flip chart book that you can buy. So yeah, that's where it gets really client centered. And that also brings in, then this is where this stuff can really be adapted to anything. I've talked to clients about this through playing Fortnite, through playing Risk, through basketball or softball analogies. I mean, like, and adults, right? Like talking through this in work and relating it and kind of diversifying that language has then really helped adults better understand how to connect to their kids in that way, right? Like, oh, wait, it is the same thing. It just looks different when we're, 50 and 40 and 30 and 12 and 10, right? It's all the same. It just looks different.
And what a great way to be able to communicate to those in our support circle what it looks like when we're in those different states of energy. Because if my partner, when he goes into dorsal energy, if he goes into his office and shuts the door and watches Star Trek for 30 minutes and then comes back out, right? Like if I know that, and then I know what mobilized energy is, right? And that's when I can be like, I need something off a really high shelf. Can you help me? Right.
Yes.
So then I know those things. And then vice versa, when I say, okay, I'm going to go read for 20 minutes, right? I'm going into dorsal energy, then I can communicate that with my support system. And then it doesn't eliminate the potential, but it makes it less likely that we will take those things personally when somebody else's energy shifts, because it's not us that shifted their energy. We all have those shifts throughout the day.
Right. And while we could have been then an influence in that shifting of energy, it's still on that person, right? And again, that's where it goes back to, if the whole family or like those who we're talking with have similar language, now it's my husband and I talking in that language. Last night he's asking me what I need, and I'm just like, I have the podcast tomorrow, so I'm just in mobilized state. Like, that's just what I'm going to be in until it's over. And then my body's going to go into dorsal for a little bit while I rest. Right. And and instead of squashing it, what we talk about, like with clients, it's then tuning into it again, that attunement, where it is, what do we need while we're in each state? Because as you mentioned, we're not going to avoid any of these states. Sometimes we go through these states in a matter of seconds, minutes, days. It just really, that's where that, again, external, internal system kind of, goes, because, if families are learning this language, then we might see things go better at home. But if school's not learning this language, we still might see struggles there, and vice versa, right? Because then we're not having that understanding.
Absolutely. I've seen it in classrooms where there will be I love that you bring up the animals, because where the students will have different animal cards that they can put on the front of their desk. And so if I'm a teacher and I look at a student and they're like slumped over on their desk, like staring at the floor, but I see that, no, that's an intentional thing, that they are, not that they're intentionally doing it, but they're being intentional about acknowledging how they're feeling, and they're communicating it to me appropriately by putting that turtle photo on their desk. I can then say, okay, this is not this child just not wanting to listen to me. This is not a child being disrespectful to me. This is a child in that dorsal phase of energy. And the internal and external piece that you're talking about, it was bringing to mind Bug's Life and Bee Movie. Because aren't they both studies in the internal versus the external, and the conflict that can come between them? And then our hero, and we're all our own hero of our own story, so our hero in both movies coming through and bringing those two pieces together and finding harmony between the internal and the external.
Yeah, I love that word, harmony. I often use that, or peace, right? Because that's really, like, another example, like maybe it's a job switch, right? And I'm helping someone right now kind of talk through what they think, and they don't know what their long-term goals are, right? And so, you kind of mentioned the turtle on the desk, right? So if we take those parallels, it's peeling back layers a little bit, almost like OT, right? Like when we think about taking a step to open a cabinet door, right? I said that in like a sentence, it seems really simple, but when we actually take a second and pause to think how many things actually had to happen internally and externally for our brain and body to work together to like get to the cabinet, open the cabinet, know what the cabinet was meant for, pull the cup out, put the cup down, right? Without breaking it. So where that tangent comes from then is we have to also then teach, like, kids aren't going to know that their slumped overness is necessarily that turtle mode, right? So then it's also helping teachers help the kids bridge that gap first, because that's also what I'm seeing in classrooms, is that almost like the assumption that like just because you're slumped means you're not and not doing things right, or how we want. And that's also what I'm finding is very much not the case, right? Like, yes, that is exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it, but they don't know that. They need that taught to them over and over again. Because that's what I hear too, is a lot of people say like, I told them once, that's all I should have to tell them. Oh gosh, no, right? Like that is good, the complete opposite. And if you think you're going to tell me something once and I'm going to remember it forever, oof, like, right? Like that's not how most of us learn. And so it's really kind of bringing those steps, more clearer to teachers too.
Absolutely. I have watched plenty of soap operas in Spanish and read the subtitles, and I still don't know Spanish. I need to hear it over and over. I need to be submersed in it. I need to experience it. I need to practice it before it becomes part of the way that I communicate those things and the way that I understand those things. And so absolutely, the idea that we would hear it one time and then be able to use it is the same as saying, well, you watched a soap opera in Spanish, now speak Spanish and say what they said.
Yeah. Yep. And that's the same, like with academics, like emotional intelligence, right? Like all of those things, we can circle that all around. And the practice you talked about, kind of some specific things I do with clients then for a nervous system is like mapping it out. And again, this is based on like Deb Dana's kind of creation of it. And that can look like painting, coloring, maybe using pipe cleaners. I've done it in a sand tray, right? Like, and it's our brain does a lot when we can process through it and put it into something else. There's a lot to be said for that process, just kind of like the OT and opening up the cabinet. Like we might not always know why or what, or, what's tangibly going on, but it's for a purpose. And it's that helpful problem solving for our brain to organize all of that information to us. Because I've had clients who have never understood why their brain is in one spot, but their body is in a different spot perpetually, right? Like we all get like that sometimes. And so again, by helping them kind of distinguish, you're right, there is two parts. And until we teach you the two parts and how the two parts can come together for that harmony and peace, it makes sense to me that you're anxious, depressed, seemingly defiant or rude, right? Like with air quotes, right? Like those aren't words I would use as I've learned more things. But yeah, that's exactly where we walk through it with.
I love you talking too about, okay, we might feel like our brain and our body are in different places, right? And I was doing a training the other day, actually, and one of the things that stuck out to me in the research for that is they talked about there's so many environments that we can proactively or reactively even escape, right? We feel unsafe, we can escape, but talking about how our brain isn't one of those. And so really being able to help individuals learn and understand what is happening in that brain system to create a sense of safety in that environment. They're not allowed to leave, get up and leave our brains.
That's so true. That internal, I mean, gosh, I can't outrun myself. Unfortunately, wherever I go, there she is. She just keeps following me. And so, yeah, it that external, being able to change the external, change my situation. Where am I? Who am I around? But man, that internal, we got to just do the work.
Yeah.
We have to. There's no other way out.
Right. And that's a perfect segue into those sensory systems, which again, like how I map it through with clients, because this is then how I can give them that agenda, right? When I think of myself and when I do best with learning new things, it's when I have like a general idea of those stepping stones. So we're at our next one, which is that sensory system. So to kind of model the science, right? Because depending on who we work with, not everyone might have total buy-in with the research models and things like that. So I talk about how we most often are taught we have 5 senses, and then through science and research, we've learned that we actually have 8 that they've identified as sensory systems now. And so those include vision, hearing, smell, taste, touch. Those would be the most common ones that we hear of. The next ones is vestibular or movement, proprioceptive or body awareness, and interoception or internal sense. And so this comes into play when we teach clients, well, how do we know when we're moving from one state to another, right? Can you already tell that? That's usually my first question. Most, depending on age, is either if we're younger, it's either like, no, it feels like a light switch is usually what I hear, which is totally normal and a great starting place for them. And then in adulthood, because research has shown most of us adults only know mad, sad, and glad as emotions. Most of them just know like, no, I'm either angry or I'm not, right? Like, and those are their kind of 2 states of being. So what I do then is, first it's the psychoeducation piece, just like the brain nervous system, right? Like labeling these, understanding which each of them is, how it applies to them. Specific activities like this can be like a scavenger hunt, find something that makes noise, find something that makes your tummy kind of go, right? Like, and doing it in those ways. It can also look, like balloon squishies, sensory bottles, slime, all of those different things and interventions for kids and even adults. I have forcefully made adults make balloon squishies because it doesn't feel like that horrible of a task. And making 2 and figuring out which one they like best and why, right? Like those are the types of practices that we can do for what I call like game time, right? Or recital time, play time, whatever it is that fits, whoever I'm talking with, is knowing these things during these simple balloon exercises. Or what's your favorite colors to look at? Do you prefer winter or summer visualization, right? Like going through each of those things, then by the time they get to a part of a day or a situation that feels dysregulating, they have already then practiced those said things for that. Oh, wait, this is what I can do at this time. And that's really what we're working on, is like, we're never going to not squash it from happening. So how do we implement these strategies in daily living just to like know these are the things that help us through all of the challenges, regardless of what challenge it is? Because that's what I've tried to get away from too, is we've seen a lot of therapies directed at anger or depression or anxiety. Well, when we look at it through the polyvagal lens and, even the language lens, that looks different to everyone. And if I'm calling it anxiety as a professional, but that might not be what they're actually saying it is. And that's, what I see as my role is to help them kind of navigate and discover then, because maybe they're coming in and we think it's anger because that's what, as society, we have deemed as, what anger looks like or should look like. Doesn't mean that it's anger at all. It could be grief. It could be identity, curiosity. There's a whole lot of things that are under that. And separating that out with the brain and the body, the internal systems, the external, really helps clients with the sensory system kind of aspect all help puzzle it together in a way that makes a little bit more sense and balance.
I love that example you gave, right, of the scavenger hunt and find something that makes your tummy go, right? And then hearing you really kind of give the explanation there, right? Of, yeah, I might think we're dealing with anger, or maybe this is a client who I feel like maybe is presenting with some grief, but I want to hear their words and know what their sensory systems are responding to that. Do you have other kind of go-tos, especially with like that scavenger hunt intervention, other things that kind of help clients make decisions or demonstrate for you where those might be?
Yeah, any sensory tool under the sun that you can think of works great for those types of exercises, right? Even using their phones, right? Again, it's meeting them wherever they're at. Like if I have had clients who, they want to play Risk together on the phone, right? So then it's okay, what sensory systems are engaged right now? Well, I can hear it. Yep. What else? Well, I'm touching the phone. Yep. I can see the screen. Yep. Oh, I can feel my internal when I'm making a decision on where to go next. Yep. And so absolutely using those, using shows, anime is another popular one that I talk about. And I do my best, right? Like I can't know everything about everything, but I do my best with those types of examples, like the Fortnite and video games. Using different sand, water beads, those types of things help with all of that too. Going outside and using nature, right? And getting those kind of aspects that we know are good for our brain and body into it too. It's, offering suggestions like notice something visually on your way home that you've never noticed before, right? Or maybe it's really like think about your partner's laugh the next time that they laugh and like what it actually sounds like. And we also talk about it the opposite way, right? As far as like, have you ever been in a situation where you're petting maybe your dog and you don't even realize that like you're petting your dog or you're like not actually feeling the fur, right? And so it's bringing those examples in. Another example is like driving home, right? Like we could be on a stretch of road and all of a sudden we're home and we're like, oh, wait, do I even remember driving that stretch of road? Right. And it's bringing in those examples again, right. Then to match, like, this is what it can look like in adult world. This is what it looks like maybe in kid world. Right. Or we talked about escaping, right. For kids, it looks like leaving the classroom or maybe even leaving the building in extreme circumstances. For adults, this might be abruptly leaving to go get a cup of coffee or to take the afternoon off because you've just had enough of whatever it was that day. It's all for that same self-protection, danger kind of purpose, right? Like that's the whole brain nervous system, is to keep us going and keep us alive. And it's acting accordingly, whether we're cognitively thinking about it or not, it's doing it. And that's where I go back to that wording of let's not work against biology, let's work with it. Because for me, I was talking with a friend, I chronically spill on myself. It's just something that most people know about me as like as an eater. And so I've adapted it, right? I have my own separate thing, I do all my stuff. And rather than like beating myself up about it or like, trying to just abruptly like be so intentional all the time, I just live with it, right? And I have made my corrections, and it's that kind of thing, right? It's noticing, yes, I tried the things. And when the things don't work, that means we alter what things we're trying. And sometimes that means just going with the flow of it instead of trying to completely change it. And that is also where I get back to like, has to be up to us. Like maybe the person in front of me doesn't want to change how they're expressing their anger or expressing their sadness. And maybe that's okay. And maybe my role is just to make sure they understand how those actions are impacting those other external systems, right? And then that's where I'm able to keep that consistent language. And that I think is helpful for families too.
I love your example of accepting that piece of who you are and adapting things in your routine and adapting the situations for who you are. And what I'm hearing in the different senses and acknowledging the scanning for danger is that we're curious about it. We're finding that out about ourselves and then accepting what it is. So if we're looking at the sense of touch and there is a certain blanket that it's like a perfectly good warm blanket, but I do not like how it feels. And I always grab another one, but I feel like I should keep it and use it because it's so perfectly good. Right. And I'm like, am I allowed to buy another blanket that feels good to me when I'm
Right.
sleeping, when I have this perfectly good blanket that nobody else is going to want because I used it, right? And then saying, okay, but I see how my sense of touch can be impacted by this particular blanket when I'm sleeping, which then can impact the way that my body or that my brain is scanning for danger. And so I feel this blanket. And now what I may be doing is putting myself into that mobilized type of energy at all night long, instead of putting myself into a touch sensation that's going to put me into a dorsal energy and give me better sleep at night, by going, okay, it's okay that my body and my brain do not like the feel of this blanket. It is okay to go get a blanket that does do that for me and does put me in that kind of energy. So all those pieces just kind of coming together and really centering around accepting ourselves, accepting these new pieces of ourselves that we're learning.
Yeah, great example. Absolutely. And that permission piece will circle back to part 2, is that self-compassion is the language I use for that. And so we'll bring that concept in when for part 2. And really the mindfulness is kind of the last kind of leg today. And that's exactly what you talked about, is it's being mindful then, and teaching what mindfulness is how do you know you didn't like the touch of the blanket? What were you able to pay attention to, right? And then it's swinging that back into the senses of, sometimes we pay attention to our touch sense more than other senses. Like, while they're all in tuned, kind of like with the brain nervous system, something's always more so driving while the rest are just kind of there waiting for their turn to drive. And they're also having that impact, right? Like those backseat drivers. And so, you see the memes like, I had to turn the radio down so I could see better. That is it, right? That's exactly what we're talking about. Because when you turn the radio down, your brain is better able to focus then on the road signs, because that's what you're shifting your attention and focus to, right? And so that's where the mindfulness comes in. And Dr. Jha wrote a book called Peak Mind in 2021. I drive to and from work to somewhat of a distance so I can listen to audiobooks. Again, something I learned about myself as someone that can't sit and read very well. And so what I've learned through her book too, is like mindfulness is simply just paying attention. Like, we dress it up as all of these different things, and we have so many separate interventions that we treat as mindfulness. And sometimes I think that's what becomes then overwhelming, when we treat it as like all of these individual things, whereas just using real life examples, right? So instead of bringing like worksheets or different things into session, it's, all right, tell me a toy you haven't played with yet in this room, right? Like, that's mindfulness. That's teaching them, to pay attention to things that maybe they wouldn't know to pay attention to, right? And so then when you're an adult and you can say, man, what is going on with my sleep? Oh, maybe it's because I just actually do not like the feel of this blanket at all, right? And that's where we see that skill and those abilities develop then over time. It's being able to say, like, I like PB&J because it's this consistency. I don't like this sandwich because it's this consistency, right? Like, if we're talking about picky eaters. And so again, that's where I really like this information and how it all comes together, because generally speaking, most any clients I've ever have been able to use this information in some capacity, whether we're talking about anxious responses, depressive responses, so like sensory processing responses. So that really, that paying attention and then working with it instead of against it are really kind of those main components.
I really like that, Bre, right? Mindfulness is paying attention, and just, it takes me back to when we were talking earlier, even just about being able to have a child in the classroom attuned to, okay, I'm sleepy or I'm overwhelmed, and this is my turtle state, right? This is my dorsal state. Being able to kind of feel a win and a victory over being able to be attuned to, I was mindful, right? I
Right,
did pay attention
exactly.
to something, even though I didn't do these 12 steps that this poster tells me, right, comprise mindfulness,
Right.
and being able to make those connections to things. I love that.
Well, and then when we transfer that into adulthood, maybe this part of the we doesn't wonder, but we wonder why, self-care is so hard for certain generations, or why it's so hard to say no or so hard to say yes, depending on, who we're talking about, right? And all of that goes back to those things, right? Like, were we taught to be attuned with ourselves? And even if we were, was it safe to ask or express what we needed, right? Because then when we talk about the psychotherapy services side of things, that's exactly where we get into those next steps of like, what I'm suggesting might not always feel safe or be safe, right? And it's making sure we know that. And, in the education world, it's helping teachers understand even slightly shifting language from a better response to a different response, right? Because just because you're telling them it's better doesn't mean that's actually true. And just because it's better for you doesn't mean it's better for them, right? And that might also get them seriously in danger at home, right? If they adapted that. And then that's again where we pull back into that internal, external of the isms, right? And all of those other kind of things at play. And, working with even clients of color, right? And acknowledging that. I have had clients of color who have experienced pretty straightforward racism. And I just acknowledge, right? Like, I am a white privileged woman and I will do my best to be here for you, right? And that's that internal system feeling safe with the external kind of cultural things we also have going on. And me as that professional in a very like welcoming, hopefully brave, safe way, sharing that with them too, that like, I will do the best I can, knowing that I am also, have a very different experience than you. And that again is that mindfulness, right? And then teaching them that is exactly what mindfulness is. It's just, here's what I'm seeing. This is what I'm paying attention to.
Yeah, I think that self-compassion piece that I know you're going to talk about in part two, but it in the awareness of the sensory systems, it allows for mindfulness to be a safer practice too, because for a lot of us, being mindful, paying attention to how we feel about things, paying attention to what we like, what we don't like, what we're drawn to, what we're experiencing. A lot of times that isn't even safe in our own mind, even if we don't express it to anybody, because if I am going on autopilot and I experience my coffee and I drink it because I have it in my house, and I'm not mindful of the taste of it, I'm not mindful of the texture of it, that sometimes can be safer to not be, or feel safer to not be mindful of it, because if I'm mindful of it, now I've got cognitive dissonance. Now I've got coffee in my house that I have to do something about potentially, or I have to do the internal work of accepting that I am making the choice to drink coffee that I don't like. So there's sometimes that feeling of safety in not being mindful. And so then when we start to open up the idea of paying attention, noticing things, allowing ourselves to feel things and think things about our experiences, what you're doing is you're building safety around that, so that those structures are in place, so that when we do have that cognitive dissonance that comes from noticing something, we can do something with it.
Exactly. And this is also comes into play when I think of the client-centered kind of approach, right? I have clients who will start talking about something without realizing how dysregulating it really is going to be for their nervous system. And so then it's that pause, especially when I think of school-based clients, right? When they're going back into the academic world after, are we in a place to do this today, or do we need to wait to a different day, right? And it's giving them that safety then to even acknowledge for themselves, like, is this the time to out loud say things, or is it not the time to out loud say things? And both are okay, right? And it's still validating all of that you're exactly right. When it doesn't feel safe, that's still that win of mindfulness. It doesn't feel safe. Check back in with yourself in 5-10 minutes and see if it feels safe. And if it still doesn't, that's fine. That's great. You're still being attuned with yourself. And that's exactly what I want, because often what I see then in school buildings is a whole bunch of students who are physically there, but not learning anything because their brain's not there. And that's also what we're seeing a lot more in the research, right? Is that like, I can't remember which one of you attested to, but right, like if our brain is elsewhere and our body's here, then that's just it, that's what's happening, right? And it's no different. And then we wonder why kids are falling behind, you know, even before the pandemic, right? We were seeing this kind of trend of we have bodies and buildings, but is that really the productiveness? Like, is that what we want, right? Or do we want kids who feel safe, connected, and able to learn, right? And that's what we want to tune into, is making sure teachers know how to do this, because they're not taught that, which was news to me. And right, like they're not taught these things. So it's teaching them these things, and it's teaching the kids these things. But then, you know, and I try not to shame or blame anyone, because, you know, when we think of our external systems, we have a lot of schools that can't afford to learn this new information or do an overhaul, or maybe even just aren't in a place to acknowledge why a different strategy could be useful to the challenges they're seeing, right? We see that whole spectrum just like we would any individual client. And so, yeah, it's a work in progress, but I keep my peace, right, by practicing and teaching the clients. Like I take home what I can and I don't what I don't. And really that modeling, right? Because for some clients, whether it's an adult or a kid, I might be that one external system that's modeling it for them. And that's what's important for me too, and why I don't mind self-disclosures within that, you know, realm, right? I never give specifics. It's mostly that general example of things. Or I'll use my kid, right? Like I have an 8-month-old, and the thing I talk about is how when he cries, a lot of generations call it fussy, right? And so we already at an age of 0 to 8 months perpetuate the idea that your vocal like needs are fussiness, right? And a problem, right? When we think of the connotation of fussy. And so I don't use that language. You know, I say, you know, Kai's probably hungry, or he's hot, or he's cold, or he needs something. He needs a change of position, right? And it's changing that language because I don't want him even at 8 months or 9 months. And I don't want my nervous system to get used to saying, well, he's just fussy, right? Or like having that, because that doesn't feel right to me either. And because of this knowledge, I know that that's not what's going on. And that's also helped me stay in my upstairs brain as a parent a little bit more than I probably would have been able to had I not learned this information first. So I'm very excited for myself for that too.
Yes, absolutely. And it's such a great segue into co-regulation and regulation. And so can you explain for people listening what those are and how they work together? Because you've been talking about it the whole time.
Exactly. It is exactly what we're talking about. And that's what's helpful then too, is putting that language in and taking those steps back, right? Even when we think of sports, right? We would hear a saying of got to get back to basics, right? Before we would add all the, you know, fanciness and pizzazz to plays or whatever it is. It's no different to this stuff. And so co-regulation is really that being with someone without any agenda, not trying to fix what they're doing, change what they're doing. You don't even have to try to understand what they're doing or why. It is just simply being with that person as kind of that like safety, grounding kind of pillar. When we think of how we learn things, our neurons need more repetitions doing things one way than another way. And so way before self-regulation can happen, we have to have repeated healthy co-regulation and over time. And that's not to say we never don't need it again. Even as humans, we always will need co-regulation. That's just how neurobiology works. You know, for kids, it's going home and asking to play. For adults, maybe it's, you know, calling a spouse after a fender bender, right? Like all of those examples are all those co-regulations that we're always going to need sometimes when we're moving through our nervous system. And that's where that window of tolerance then grows over time for that regulation, right? Sometimes we can self-regulate for a little bit before we just need that co-regulation. Sometimes it's just a straight like, nope, I need to be around my people, right? Depending on what's going on. And that's again where we use those senses, right? Like I'll talk through things with people, like when you're feeling in shutdown, do you like to be around people or not around people? Does it depend on why we're in shutdown, right? Same with mobilize, because again, I don't want to assume just because I don't want anyone around me when I'm in shutdown, that doesn't mean that that's how everyone works. And it's making sure they understand that to know how to ask for things, right? And so, again, my husband and I now have different language when I can tell he's going into that mobilized or the shutdown, and he can tell when I'm going into that mobilized or the shutdown. And so instead of it looking, like raising voices or not understanding, it's just like you talked about, hey, I need to go play video games for 20 minutes and then I'll be back upstairs. Sounds great. I've got it, right? And it's, again, that balance, right? As like that partnership and understanding that. And that's what that co-regulation is. Exactly that, whether it's with adults or kids.
Absolutely, Bre. And I love that. And I love that kind of discussion about the communication piece with those around us, right? And I know that that's one of the things that's on our topic list for section 2. And so we are really excited to be able to continue this conversation and learn more about all of these pieces, because it's such incredible information. And I really, really appreciate everything that you've shared with us today. This has been wonderful. And as we kind of wrap up today too, I do want to highlight, you've got some really exciting upcoming trainings as well. And I know you've been asked to speak at the Psychosocial Oncology Professionals Symposium, maybe better known as POPS, right? And that's in October, correct?
Yes. So as I've transitioned into the private practice world, I've given a presentation at Bettendorf Middle School about adolescent mental health, using all of the same kind of ideas to help parents understand. Because, then when we add the development piece on top, right, like that's where that level for them was important, and understanding specifically the adolescent brain and all of these things. And then the POPS concert see, that's where my brain went, as the Quad City
for the Quad City. Yes, POPS is a holiday concert. Yes.
For the POPS symposium, I actually did an internship at Gilda's Club, and that is a community organization for individuals impacted by cancer. It has support for both the individual impacted by cancer and family members. And so someone reached out to me to kind of give this information and how it relates to kids who have been impacted by a parent's cancer, or a caregiver's cancer. Something I did at my time at Augustana College was Camp Kesem, which is a summer camp for kids whose parents have cancer or have passed from cancer. And so it was a really cool ask to be able to tie in kind of all of these different areas I've been in before and really wrap them up, into one. I did similar trainings while as an intern in Gilda's Club to better understand like the impacted of ACEs or adverse childhood experiences. And so, very excited about that this October.
Yeah, that's an incredible way, like you said, to blend all of those skill sets of yours. And if people have other questions about that, or want to talk to you more about that training, or reach out for your services and your knowledge, they can find you right at Blue Tree Counseling and Consultation. The website there is bluetreecounseling.org, and they can reach you directly at Brianne at bluetreecounseling.org as well.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for being here, Bre. This has been wonderful. We are really, really looking forward to part 2. So if you're listening to this training, make sure to check out part 2 as that comes out, where we will be discussing building processes, skills, and integrating practices that support building emotional intelligence. So we're very, very much looking forward to that. Also, if you're listening to this and you heard a resource mentioned, check our show notes, because all of the resources, all of the books that Bre discussed will be linked there in the show notes, as well as a link to our You Need a Counselor podcast episode that discusses the Gilda's Club. So if you heard this and you said, well, what is that? Check out that link for the Gilda's Club episode of You Need a Counselor podcast. So thank you so much, Bre, for being here. Thank you, Dr. Grote. And thank you, everybody, for listening. And don't forget that you need a training.
Thank you so much for joining us today on You Need a Training. We encourage you to share this episode with anyone you think may be interested in learning more about mental health techniques and interventions. Also, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram to stay up to date with all upcoming training opportunities. And don't forget to listen to our other podcast, You Need a Counselor, where we talk with individuals around the world about their counseling experiences. Heart & Solutions is proud to provide CE-eligible trainings for our counseling community. This training may be eligible for continuing education credit hours through either the National Board for Certified Counselors, provider number 7376, or the Association of Play Therapy, provider number 21-645. To obtain CE hours for today's training, be sure to follow the steps in the description below.